Realism is still the ascendant genre today, which means writers are still attracted to it as the genre in which they like to experiment and to write. And we've seen some of this experimentation down two main roads. The first one was that of giving personal histories to characters that made us understand how they were formed. Characters were not born like romance characters are, but they're actually shaped and molded by what happens to them in life. And oftentimes this development that we witnessed as readers was the result of life disillusioning their illusions. And the technical term for this is parody, which is give your head a shake and recognize that your illusions are kind of ridiculous and you're going to need to change your view of the world to accommodate to the reality that you're living in. So this is like the pressure of growing up. You thought what you wanted to do in life was a certain way, and then as a result of living, you recognized that you had some illusions that needed to be corrected. And your ability to laugh at them and change ends up being how you formed yourself. The end point of parody, of course, is having characters without any control over their lives at all. And Kurt Vonnegut wrote a book called Slaughterhouse-Five, in which he offered a metaphor for this, which is a bug in amber. And it was a ladybug who was caught in volcanic molten rock that hardened and absolutely imprisoned the ladybug, so that no matter what the ladybug ever wanted to do, it was not going to be able to change its fate or its life. And this is the ultimate of larger forces determining you, and this wound up in victim stories. So the subgenre of naturalism was no human agency at all, and that kind of reached the end of the line for this kind of experimenting about just how much shaking your characters needed to do with their heads before it was just knocking up against a brick wall. Now, this was a long process in realism going down this road, and to give you an example of when, how far back writers in realism were actually experimenting with this, I offered the example of a book called Esther Waters, written by George Moore in 1899. And Esther was an ordinary girl. She was not a beautiful heroine. She was just an ordinary girl. She had a very plain face. She couldn't read, and she was farmed out as a servant. And the first place she was farmed out, her boss didn't like her and so fired her. And she was farmed out to another place to be a servant, and the cook there took a dislike to her. And so she spends a lot of time worrying about getting fired because she can't go home. Her mother has too many mouths to feed and would not be able to take her back in. She's far away from London, so she doesn't even know how she would get back. She doesn't have the money to take any kind of transportation. And so she does end up getting fired again. She's eventually sexually exploited. She becomes pregnant, and she is just doomed by larger forces. And so that's one example of how realism was experimented with by having characters have to face sort of where they were in life and what their illusions were as they sort of go to the school of hard knocks. Another instance of naturalism that might be more well known is John Steinbeck's Grapes of Wrath, which was about a farm working family in the 30s during the Depression years. They get evicted and they migrate to California thinking that their fate might be better there, and of course it's frying pan into the fire, and hopelessness becomes even more hopelessness. That kind of bug in amber story ends up just hitting a wall, because there is a cost to extreme disenchantment. It strips humans of the will to find anything meaningful or satisfying in their lives. And it turns out people tend to look for stories that have a little romance and give them a little bit of hope and a little bit of inspiration about hauling their sorry butts out of bed every day to be living life and being human. So that was the first road to realism as writers experimented. And the second one was a deep dive into human consciousness. Now, the modernists of the first half of the 20th century were very involved in this, and we might want to consider why from a larger perspective. And one thing to bring into consideration was an overall move philosophically for the previous 2 centuries that artists and intellectuals made in becoming more and more fascinated with how the human mind worked. Now, this could have had to do with there being a seismic shift in philosophy with 18th century Immanuel Kant, who theorized that the human mind organizes stimuli from the world in the human consciousness, that it's not a direct appreciation of what is being observed in existence in the world, but the reality actually is generated in the consciousness, and therefore reality lives in the structures of the human mind rather than the human mind being something that needs to figure out what it's looking at as the primary in the world. So that locates reality for humans in a more interior way than had been presumed before. Another move in this direction was the invention of psychology. Freud was early 20th century, and he was very focused on how the subconscious works and how it affects human conscious behavior and what goes on inside a human's mind, and that was very interesting to writers. So there was an impetus to be investigating and experimenting with the role of the human mind in a character's existence. And then with the modernists, of course, there were historical influences because they spanned the 2 world wars in the first half of the 20th century. And they were so appalled by this violence overtaking Western culture that they wanted to shake up any assumptions that culture had before that, because it led to catastrophe. And so these were trends, cultural trends, in the 20th century. So what did that mean for writers? Well, many writers in the 20th century began to question the relationship of our minds to the outside world and the role language played in that, which makes some sense because the tools of a writer are language, and there became a really extreme questioning of what it was when you were using language. Were you representing something in the outside world, or were just words bumping around in your own mind, creating your own reality, so that we all really did have our own truths, and that there was not a truth out in the world? Everybody just organized their own truths, their own realities in their minds. Now, that was the high modernism of the first half of the 20th century, but there was another permutation of it in the 1960s with postmodernism. And that took some of the premises of modernism, being the interest in the interiority of human functioning, and also skepticism about meaning and how you arrive at it. And it went in the direction of challenging everything we think we know. That language does not give us an anchor into some kind of objective truth, but it is a conglomeration of things we tell ourselves that we think we know. And so you might recognize words like deconstruction and meta-narratives that comes from that still in our present day. So experiments in realism down these 2 roads led to many inventions, both subgenres and ways of telling a story. And we mentioned in the last webinar the invention of free and direct discourse, which came more and more into the human mind. As you were hearing a story, you were feeling like you were actually hearing the character's thoughts rather than thoughts and discourse being reported to you. Another invention would be radically cut up timelines. Now, this was not just a flashback, but a cut up in the timeline that was meant to force the reader to participate in creating the meaning of putting that timeline back together again. So this was a sort of a narrative invention of how to tell a story that had a meaning behind it about what a writer was saying about how reality is created. Now we have this whole hundreds of years legacy of writers experimenting with genre in English prose narrative. And we saw how that started out with ancient romance and how pressures were placed on ancient romance to come up with a more modern idea of romance where characters became, they were not gods, they were not aristocrats, they were starting to come down to be more recognizable and ordinary characters. And the pressure was on them to confront their illusions and recognize the world around them for what it was. So this, transpired into Gothic and to, mystery and to detective and to all of the subgenres that have been played with in that direction and invented as a new way, a new kind of story to tell, a new way of telling a story. And then we had this huge thing that happened with the invention of history. It not only did it develop the idea of a nonfiction documentation of life, but it was taken and played with to be a historical story and then to be paired with romance so that you had a historical romance. And now the genres are starting to proliferate to the point that they're becoming more nuanced, they're becoming more alive in the sense that you can put different genres together and create something new. So you had the subgenres of autobiography and biography and confession as well, being both fictional and non-fictional inventions along that road. Now, all of these genres and subgenres still sit on our shelves in our bookstores and libraries, and there are many of them occur within a single story, so that you can see writers now playing with them all together because they have so much to play with right now. And I'm hoping that this quick history of genre has helped to enrich your reading experience in that you can recognize what a writer is doing by the kind of story that's being told and the tools that are being drawn in to tell that story. As a writer and an academic, I found it fascinating to walk in the footsteps of writers who came before to see how they innovated in this long period of narrative development. Because storytelling is truly a universal tool. It's something that every single human culture does, in that it tells stories that allow us and enable us to understand, who we are in life on this planet. Because storytelling is the only kind of writing that allows us to see life through someone else's eyes. And as a result, it not only soothes our souls, but it helps us figure out how to find meaning in life. And it is it's a truly human invention that has a history, and the history helps understand our stories.